Thank you for coming. I'm Malin Enström, a visual artist here in St. John's, Newfoundland, and also a criminologist. And I'm really happy to see you all here and to discover the show with you, because I actually hadn't seen it until today. So it was really nice. I could see it, but I waited so I could see it with you. And I'm very happy to see it. Actually, I'm quite emotional about it. So let me tell you about the art piece downstairs, which I have named Inversion. It started as an abstract, quantitative piece of art, piece of work that slowly kind of transformed into an art piece visualizing a very personal story. When COVID started to trickle into Canada and Newfoundland in March, we had a fairly good idea of what that meant or what it could mean to us, because we had already been fortunate enough to see what it did elsewhere on the news, and also the impact that it had worldwide. I was holding my breath. I think a lot of us was holding our breaths those first couple of weeks, hoping for the best, but also cautiously preparing for the worst kind of outcome. I found it a very hard time, personally, and I had a very hard time wrapping my head what this pandemic meant to me personally, but also globally, and to my family in Sweden, who had a very different approach to how to deal with COVID. And to live in the middle of a pandemic it's an historical event, which in itself I think was fascinating, but it was scary, but it was also something that we shared with the entire world. And in all of this, it was really fascinating that we as an entire population focused on one thing. I thought that global collective thinking was quite remarkable, and in some way also very beautiful. So any news channel that we watched, there was always someone taking another person's temperature. And with that, I felt like the whole world was taking its temperature all of a sudden. There was always someone in a car, someone reaching in with a hazmat suit and just making sure that they were allowed to go somewhere or pass certain things, so that the thermometer was always on the news. It was a very collective behavior that way. And the world was turning completely upside down. And we also turned ourselves inside out in the form of body temperature. And my way of reflecting on this was also to show my inner temperature as a way of communicating. I found temperature is a way of communicating in itself. You can communicate discomfort, but also an awareness. And an awareness of my temperature became essential to be in some kind of a control during this. It gave my life a normalcy and a routine, and I think that is what I wanted the show Inversion to represent. So I'm going to take you through the process of how this show came about. So these are data sheets. I started taking my temperature on March 24th, and it ended on July 31st. And I had a sheet of paper in the kitchen on which I recorded my temperature 3 times a day. 6 a.m., midday, noon, and then at 6 p.m. I started taking my temperature at the time of the Newfoundland lockdown, so that was when we were on alert level 5. And ended when things were opening up in a fairly normal manner again, when we are on alert level 2, which is where we still are today. So that came out to 130 days. So in the end, because I took that temperature 3 times a day, I had 390 data entries. And to be honest, I really didn't know what to do with this. Some days it was just annoying papers in the kitchen that just got moved around, and just something that I had to do. And my husband also took his temperature for a while, and my daughter, so we took her temperature. She's 12, so she trickled off pretty quick. But I stuck with it. And I knew that this data told a story, but I wasn't sure how to make the transition from raw data into art. And what I ended up doing, sorry, it was really cold before, now I'm really warm. What I ended up doing was transforming it, the raw data that I had, into an Excel sheet, just to give it a little bit more structure. And from there, I decided to color code it so I could make it into a visualization, and to just have a better idea of what it is that I actually had collected. And I find data very fascinating on its own. I think it tells its own story, but it also has its limitation when it stands on its own without any comparison. So I find when you add color codes to data, I find that it tells an even better story because you can actually see patterns. And I think this is what Anne referred to as well when she talked about my day job as a criminologist, because I work with a lot of data and I color code it to see behavior or patterns in behavior. So it was a process that I was quite comfortable with. So it became more of a visualization when I added the colors. But I wanted to do this, but I didn't really knew what color code I was going to use. So I tried to find if there was a specific used color scheme that correlated with body temperature. But I couldn't really find anything that felt very genuine. It's a lot of just bodies with temperature, and it goes like really red, really blue, really yellow, really green. I didn't feel like that's exactly what I was looking for. So I went back to the thought process that I had in the beginning on why I actually collected this data in the first place, beginning in March during the alert level 5. And as I said earlier, my temperature became a way of communicating, both as comfort but also an awareness. And with that, I mean an awareness of myself. I got to have a focus on myself that I really haven't had before, not in that way anyway. Because of quarantine and lockdowns, I had the time to actually, the time and the reason to actually sit down and think and not have interrupted thinking. But it was also really intense awareness of what was happening globally. Outside myself, my personal bubble, but also the Newfoundland bubble. Because we are so wonderfully safe here, which is a really wonderful thing, but I think that safety also allows a really kind platform to allow yourself to think in a very, to reflect in a very safe manner. So, meanwhile, of course, we have this pandemic storm just roaring around the world, and that's exactly what everyone was talking about. All the other stuff that we had as big concerns previous, like global warming, all the stuff that fill our minds and give us worries, that was kind of just left. And the thing is that they hadn't stopped. Those things were still happening, we're just not talking about them anymore, or as much. And I remember desperately seeking through the news channel, just finding some other news that was not COVID related, and that was really hard. That was really, really hard, and I found that extremely tiresome to this point where I just stopped watching the news for a while because I couldn't do it. So, I mentioned global warming because that was one of the things that was on my mind a lot before, or still, but before the pandemic hit. It didn't stop or retreat because we are going through a pandemic. It's still a big part of our reality. But instead of thinking of global temperature changes, our focus is now on ourselves. And we focus on the temperature changes of humans instead of the world. So when considering the color scale that I could use, I thought it was interesting that the world temperature had been rising, but now also because everyone, or not everyone, but thousands and thousands of people having a fever, the human temperature had also gone up. And I thought that was a really interesting correlation. it kind of mirrors increased global warming, but in our own nature. So I thought that was really interesting and beautiful in a way. So that became another way of looking at the data. The individual experience reflected in the global, that each of our lives are connected to larger events. So the color scale that I ended up with was one created by a man named Edward Hawkins. He is a professor of climate science at the University of Reading, and he came up with a data visualization for global warming. And he uses minimalistic graphic and just stripped it out of unnecessary clutter, which I personally really like to do. I like very straight lines. Portraying global warming with blue stripes, which is the cooler years, progressing to predominantly red stripes, which is representative of the warmer years. So what you see here is his visualization of global warming between 1850 and 2018. So 1850 being the left side of the graphic, closer to me. So of course he had a very long-term trend to visualize with his data. I wanted to apply the same color scheme to my data to see what it looked like. So when I started to take my temperature in March, I really felt like the world was extremely chaotic. And I almost assumed that COVID was going to be something that happened to all of us, that we were all going to get it. I definitely assumed that I was going to get it. It was just a matter of time. And that was a very interesting notion too, to allow oneself to go to a very dark place, I guess, or go really dark and reflecting on death, but still being in a fairly healthy body. And it was scary, but also liberating to understand that I couldn't do anything. I could help it by protecting myself and my loved ones by washing my hands and doing all the following the regulations, but at the same time, there was nothing that I could do. There were no guarantees really, and it was that notion of I've never been promised a long life. No one has been promised a long life. And I think COVID really pointed out that, the vulnerability of life, that it can, even if your health happened, if you get it, it could have devastating consequences. That some leaves fall when they're yellow, but some also fall when they're green. We really had no guarantees. And I think that became very apparent during this time. I couldn't really be mad at the invisible. COVID didn't have a personality that I could be mad at. I really couldn't get angry at destiny. So what we could do, of course, is to be careful enough. And by doing so, we could come out of this and be able to tell future generations on how this story actually ends. Where we were and are seeing the future every day, but we also see it change on a daily basis. So the purpose of that data that I collected was because I really wanted to see how high my temperature was going to be when I got COVID. I was really interested in that, in my own pandemic COVID peak temperature, because I really assumed that I was going to get it. So I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to see how high can I go. I didn't get it, knock on wood. So the scale or the peak that I had assumed was going to happen, it didn't, thank goodness. So my own temperature, so this is based on the scale that Hawkins were using as well. So my own temperature range was pretty narrow, as it turns out. It kept pretty steady. It ranged from as low as 35.2 Celsius to as highest at 37.7 Celsius. So the global average about 37.4. I realized that my mean is 36.7. So I'm really quite below what's considered the normal. And I really thought it would be the opposite. I thought I was going to be showing a much more higher temperature, or at least more range in my temperature because it was 3 times a day. But it turns out that I was fairly clustered in the middle, which is why there's so many light colors in the art piece downstairs, because I really had my most of the data there in the middle. So the highest temperature I only hit once in July, and it wasn't even, didn't have fever, obviously, at all during these months, or a regular common cold. And the lowest was hitting 3 times in April. Interesting enough, I seem to have all my extremes happening in midday. I don't know what that means at all, but that's where my extremes happen, being the lowest or the coldest. So now I had all this. This is just a snapshot from the Excel sheet where I had all the data and the temperature and the color coding and the days. And I still didn't really know what to do with this. So, yes, right, so that's the dates and the time. So the first row is all morning, then it's the midday, and then it's the evening at the last row there. When I did this, I also put in the Excel sheet changes. So, for example, I put in the first day of the double bubble, first day of no cases, when the Atlantic bubble opened up, because I still want to see if the local events, still had an effect on my temperature or how my body reacted, and if that could plays a different role, let's say, because I still thought I was going to get COVID. So I want to see that if we have a double bubble or the Atlantic bubble, when I get it, I want to see where that peaked in that. So when I color coded it, I had to take a step back and just figure out how to display it. I was initially thinking of making it into a video piece with more like a timeline where it all floated, as in the 130 days kind of floated with the 3 days. But it didn't really, I tried out a couple of versions, it didn't really work out. It didn't really speak to me, so I ended up simplifying it completely and just created the artwork actually in Excel and then transformed it into images. And those are the ones that you're seeing in the show. So the show downstairs, let me explain it to you. It's exactly that what you see when you look at the art pieces downstairs. You see 30 panels in total. There are 3 rows with 10 panels in each row. Because I had 390 data entries, I needed to divide them to fit into the 30 panels. So what I did was, to show the data, is to have 13 days represented in each panel. So the top row downstairs is all morning temperatures. The middle row is the midday temperatures, and the bottom row is the evening temperatures. So you can follow each day by looking at one row from top to bottom. Does that make sense? So that straight row in those 3 panels represents one day. So all the 130 days are there in order, but they're divided into 3 sections. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'll be downstairs later. So that's that. I also have this little video of all the panels together, so I'm going to just leave that there. So, the show is pretty straightforward. It's a very straightforward abstract art piece. There are no hidden meanings. It's a very personal art piece. You get to see my inner in a way that I normally would be very uncomfortable showing. I tend to be very private that way, but with COVID and the first 4 to 5 months, I found that the public conversation completely dominated over the personal conversation. So to be able to turn inwards, I felt like I was more in control of that conversation. And I felt like in art, I have control in art, but I'm also free in my art. And in a crisis like this, I think it's more important than ever that we are able to be allowed to be free in our art. And I think that COVID has really taught us a lot about art and the importance of it in our lives on a daily basis. Be it music, visual, music, literature, a lot of us leaned on art to get us through this, and we still are. And I'm counting Netflix into this completely. I think it marked an obvious place, the obvious place that art has in our lives and in our conversations about the world, but also humanity. So with that being said, I would like to open up the floor for questions and discussions. If you feel comfortable, I would love to hear your stories about how art has played a role in your lives during these 6 months as well. Thank you so much for being here.